Hey folks, this is Rhykker with a Diablo 3 patch 2.4.2 Firebird's Archon Wizard build. This build is adapted to make use of the revised Firebird set, and on the public test server has cleared well into the Greater Rift 90s. Firebird Archon will never be as strong as it was in Season 6, but that's because of some bugged mechanics that were exploited, which we go over in the video linked here. Still, if you're committed to Firebirds, then these are the adjustments you'll want to make in order to keep playing Archon. Do note that this video was recorded before patch 2.42 went live, and is mostly just intended to prove that Firebirds is still viable for Season 7. It's not yet 100% clear what the absolute optimal setup will be, but these are the skills that the top leaderboard clears are using. So first, let's take a look at the items. Specifically the Firebird set. The 2-piece bonus is unchanged, and basically just gives you an extra life. Now the 4-piece bonus is where we start to see the changes. When you deal damage to an enemy with a fire skill, then that enemy starts burning for 3 seconds. It applies a damage over time effect, and if you hit them with a different fire skill, it'll apply a second damage over time effect, and you can stack this a total of 3 times. 3 different fire skills will apply 3 different damage dots, and once you have the third applied, they'll then go from the burning state to the ignited state, and will keep burning until they die. Then the 6-piece bonus increases your damage by 120% and increases your damage reduction by 3% for every enemy that you have ignited, and this effect can stack up to 20 times. If you've ignited a nearby elite or champion, then you'll automatically be at max stacks. So that's what this playstyle involves. You're running around, you're igniting enemies, and trying to maintain that maximum Firebird buff. Before we take a look at the other items, we're first going to take a look at the skills. So first we'll want Arcane Torrent Flame Ward. This will be the first of our 3 fire skills that we're using to build up our stacks. While channeling this skill, we take less damage. We will be particularly vulnerable when we're outside of Archon form, so having some damage mitigation will really help. The Arcane Torrent is also able to strike more than one enemy at a time. Next we'll want Ice Armor Crystallize. This has become a staple to the wizard when combined with the ring that we're going to go over in a minute. This is a purely defensive option that is meant to help keep you alive. You'll note that the focus here is on melee damage reduction, and that's because ranged attacks could mostly be dodged. We'll also want to be in the thick of melee when we're dealing our damage, because there's yet to be a very strong ranged wizard build. Turns out most wizard builds are melee ranged. Next we'll want Explosive Blast Chain Reaction. This is a skill that you'll want to be permacasting when outside of Archon form. This is our second fire skill, and it's going to help us build up those stacks quickly. Now normally I don't give recommendations on what skill to put on what hotkey, but in this case I will suggest putting Explosive Blast on your number 1, and thereafter doing the numlock trick to permacast it. This is because when you're in Archon form, your number 1 will be a similar skill that you'll want to be permacasting. This way, regardless of whether you're in Archon or non-Archon form, your numlock trick will keep the skills permacast. If you're not sure what the numlock trick is, here's a crash course. Go into your options, key bindings, scroll down to Action Bar Skill 1, assign it to numpad 7 or whatever other numpad key you want, accept. Then you'll want to hold down your new hotkey, so in my case it's number 7 on the numpad, and while doing that, press the numlock key. Then release both at the same time. As you can see, with fingers off the keyboard, the skill will now continue to permacast. The only time it will not permacast is if you hold down left mouse button to move around. Once I release left mouse button, you can see that the skill will continue to cast again. This is a big reason why people assign their mouse scroll wheel to force move. When mouse scroll wheel is on force move, then instead of registering a single continuous click, you get a lot of small clicks, which gives a numlock trick time to do its work between those mouse clicks. Basically, it simulates clicking a whole bunch of times instead of holding down a single key a lot. Back to our skills. Explosive Blast Chain Reaction will also be a defensive option, and we'll explain why in just a bit. Our third and final fire skill will be Magic Weapon Ignite. Believe it or not, but it turns out that this can be a source of fire damage. Next we'll want Teleport Safe Passage. Most good builds in this game have mobility options, escape options. Teleport will save your life. It'll also allow for better positioning. With this rune, you can actually teleport into the midst of enemies take a bit less damage while finishing up your stacks and then quickly popping into Archon. It should then be no surprise that even on Archon we're going with the teleport rune. Again, this is just due to the immense utility of having the ability to teleport. Now, some people have suggested trying for the combustion rune on Archon so that you can still build up your burn stacks while on Archon, but when you're pushing high greater rifts, you really can't afford to use that mobility. As for our passives, we'll want Audacity, because again, this is a melee range wizard. You might wonder, well, hold on, doesn't Archon have that long range beam? While that is true, you actually want to be doing the brunt of your damage with the left click, the primary fire. That does more damage and is generally able to hit more enemies. The only time you might want to consider using the beam is if you need to temporarily port away to not die. Then yeah, maybe take a couple seconds of shooting with your right click, but you really want to be in the thick of things, in the melee range. Between your Firebird 2-piece set and Unstable Anomaly, that gives you 2 free revives, and will really help with pushing those high greater rifts. Given we said that this is a melee wizard, you may find it a little odd that we're then going with Power Hungry as our next passive. And this is something that we actually see the top couple players on the wizard PTR leaderboard using. That said, the alternative would be to go with Blur to decrease your damage taken. Now, I won't pretend to know for sure, but my guess would be that they're going with Power Hungry in this case in order to squeak out a little bit of extra damage for when they're not able to be engaging in melee. When you're pushing the highest greater rifts, every second can make the difference between a failed and a successful greater rift, so trying to add some significance to the damage that you deal when not in melee would help build towards that. That said, this makes you a little bit more glass cannon, so Blur is still a very good option. Lastly, we'll want Evocation because we want to maintain as much uptime on Archon as possible. Going back to the items, we'll need Fazula's Improbable Chain. If we take a look at Archon again real quick, you'll see that each enemy killed while in Archon form increases your damage by 6% for the remaining duration of Archon. What Fazula's does is make you start with up to 50 stacks on your Archon. Next we'll want the Compass Rose and the Traveler's Pledge. This is so that when we're standing still in the thick of melee, in Archon form, we're dealing that mass damage. Then while we're outside of Archon form, if we're trying to get some heat off us, we can move around to increase our survivability. But also if you want to be trying to deal a bit of damage out of Archon form with your Arcane Torrent while you're standing still and channeling it, again you'll get that damage buff. Next we want a Halo of Arlese. This is the ring that combines with our Ice Armor. This gives us survivability and utility, and it will combo with our Ancient Parthan Defenders. These skills and items synergize together such that when you're in melee, you're going to be stacking damage reduction. Your weapon and offhand needs to be Chandodo's Will and Chandodo's Force. Before you pop into Archon form, you want to make sure you've stacked 20 Chandodo stacks. Basically, every time you hit an enemy when out of Archon form, you gain 1 stack. Every stack adds another 350% weapon damage to the wave of destruction that you'll get once in Archon form. So very important to wait for the 20 stacks before you pop Archon. So that's the 2 things that you want to be managing. 20 stacks Chandodos, 20 stacks Firebird, then pop into Archon. In our cube, we'll go with an Orb of Infinite Depth. This gives us damage and damage reduction on our Explosive Blast. Once you teleport into the midst of enemies, your Explosive Blast chain reaction will pop off several explosions. You'll get those 4 stacks, and that's the optimum time to then pop into Archon form, benefit from those 6 seconds of increased damage. And of course, the damage reduction will just be helping us out at all times. We'll also want the Swami in our cube. This will allow us to maintain a little bit of a damage buff while outside of Archon. And lastly, we need an Obsidian Ring of the Zodiac as our way of reducing the cooldown on Archon. This is what combos with our Arcane Torrent. Arcane Torrent will be lowering our cooldowns. For your gems, you'll of course want a Bane of the Trapped. Since we're mostly melee, this will be a flat damage buff at all times. You'll want a Bane of the Stricken for fighting Rift Guardians. And then the last gem is somewhat negotiable. You can go with a Gogok of Swiftness for some added cooldown reduction and some nice dodge chance. But I've also seen the Pain Enhancer used. For your Paragon Points, get your total move speed up to 25%, then dump everything into Intelligence. For offense, start with cooldown reduction, then crit chance and crit damage. For defense, armor, then life percent, then all resist. Then for utility, either resource cost reduction or area damage first, depending on whether or not you feel you need the resource cost reduction, and then life on hit as a third. The playstyle of this build is a little clunky, however, and basically revolves around grouping up as many white enemies as possible before bringing in an elite or champion pack, igniting that elite or champion pack, and then letting the elite or champion live as long as possible while you kill all the white enemies. It can be pretty difficult to ignite 20 enemies, but igniting one elite or champion is super easy. In the gameplay video, I'm really not doing the best job at grouping up enemies, but to play this optimally, that is what you want to be doing. Now again, this build has been used to clear Greater Rifts in the 90s. That said, even with unoptimized gear, and with little practice with this build, you can easily clear a Greater Rift 70, which is the big requirement for your season journey in Season 7. This was lowered from 80, and this is to account for some of the nerfs that are happening in order to make the season journey still attainable. We go over these nerfs in this video, linked down here. We're not going to go over exactly what stats you want on every piece of gear, because again, this was recorded on PTR, and the build will be optimized as the season commences, so do check back in the future for updates with all that info. That wraps up this video. Thanks for watching. Check out these other videos. Leave a comment saying what your favorite wizard build of all time has been. Special thanks to my Patreon and Twitch supporters for making these videos possible. And subscribe to join Rhyker's Raiders to be alerted when the next Diablo guide goes live.